Okay, hello again. I'm saying again because the first video I made got didn't get processed, so I'm doing it all over again. So it was like a 50-minute video gone. So doing it all over again. So whether this is another 50-minute video or not, we will see. So you might get lucky. I might be shorter this time, but hopefully not. I want to cover all the material that needs to be covered. I'm just doing it in a different method. I'm not using the Yuja video app that comes with Canvas because that seemed to be where the problem was. I'm using QuickTime, so you have a different quality or look, as you probably can see on here, than there was with um, Yuja video. And you can probably hear the train out there too, even though I'm in Fayard. It's still pretty loud. So anyways, all right, kind of get started. So there was one last thing we didn't get a chance to talk about today in class about truth. And so I'm going to go over that. And then there are 6 passages from the religious character section that I want to talk about. And that will be it for today. Now, in my first version of this, it took about 50 something minutes. We'll see how this takes. So remember, we talked about truth and we talked about the common and the higher, lower, a lot of those distinctions, and how the smelliness of the common people and so on and so forth. And so, in the elitism of Nietzsche and all these types of themes. One of the last things I want to talk about, but we ran out of time today, was how that kind of gets brought together in one particular aphorism where both the truth and common come in. And it's one of the last ones in the free spirit section. It's number 43. So I'll start with that. He says, "Are they new friends of truth, these upcoming philosophers?" So remember, that's one of the themes that Nietzsche kind of really stresses, that he is one of these philosophers of the future, or he's announcing the philosophers of the future. It's somewhat ambiguous whether he puts them in that category or not. He does explicitly say that he will be misunderstood, that he will be understood by the philosophers of the future. Whether he will be understood because he's saying what they will say, or he will be understood because he was anticipating what they will say, that's a whole other question. But those are the kinds of philosophers he's thinking of here. Those philosophers of the extra moral period that we talked about in class today. This is later Thursday. Probably, since all philosophers so far have loved their truths. But they certainly will not be dogmatists. It would offend their pride as well as their taste if their truth were a truth for everyone, which has been the secret wish and hidden meaning of all dogmatic aspirations so far. My judgment is my judgment. Other people don't have an obvious right to it, too. Perhaps this is what such a philosopher of the future will say. Perhaps, he says. So if he were a philosopher of the future, he would know. We must do away with the bad taste of wanting to be in agreement with the majority. Good is no longer good when it comes from your neighbor's mouth. And how could there ever be a common good? The term is self-contradictory. Whatever can be common will never have much value. The term is in the end, it has to be as it is and has always been. Great things are left for the great, abysses for the profound, delicacy and trembling for the subtle, and all in all, everything rare for those who are rare themselves. So there's a sense in which, again, as I've stressed a few times, there's a kind of a comparison and yet a difference between um, Nietzsche and Socrates, or Nietzsche, Socrates, Plato, because Plato will also say something similar, right? In the Republic, Plato will talk about the philosopher king. We talked a little bit about that in class. And the philosopher king is that exceptional individual who gets the truth. So they stand above, they're the philosopher king. So there is a kind of hierarchy and elitism there. But the difference is that the truth that the philosopher gets in the Platonic model is one that is outside of life. It's kind of an eternal, timeless truth, a kind of dogmatic truth, to use the word that Nietzsche uses again and again, a one-size-fits-all truth. And but the truth that the higher individuals will get will be the truth of that time for that society, right? It's going to be a life-bound, life-based understanding of truth, and yet it won't be one that everyone can understand. It certainly won't be one that the common will understand. So there is a sense in which the truth will be beneficial to everyone. We'll see that in one of the later aphorisms I want to read, but it certainly won't be something that is a common truth or a truth that's easily understood. As he put it at the very end, everything rare is for those who are rare themselves. And the same is going to be true for the kinds of truths that he is talking about here. So as we go on into the later sections of Beyond Good and Evil, we will talk about that some more. But that was the main thing that I wanted to talk about in the last section of what I want to talk about in the free spirit. So I want to spend the rest of class, the rest of this lecture, going through the 6 aphorisms on the religious character. So we've already talked about religion a few times, and we've already seen that Nietzsche is not a big fan, but what does that mean? And that's one of the things that I want to talk about in this discussion. It's not just simply religion's bad, period, walk away from it. There's certain reasons why he thinks certain aspects of religion are bad. But there's also aspects of religion that pick up on certain aspects of human nature too. And one of them is this theme of cruelty. So kind of as a way of introduction, and something I would have said, something I said in the previous version of this lecture, is that in Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche talks about the origin of guilt and conscience in us. And it is true, because remember, Nietzsche was a specialist in philology, which is like basically studying the classics. He basically studied early ancient Greek and Roman texts and history in order to understand and be able to interpret those texts. And one of the things that he realized is that they didn't really have a sense of guilt or conscience in the same way we do. They would regret their actions and learn from their actions, according to Nietzsche, but the sense of guilt or conscience is a kind of internal form of punishment, is an internal form of policing of our actions. That was not something that Nietzsche felt was in the ancient Greek world. Because remember, the ancient Greek world, as he understands, it's that pre-moral phase. So actions were punished for their consequences, not because of any intent that was involved. Whereas guilt comes into play with respect to intent and will. And religion has a big role to play in that. And how did we get there? According to Nietzsche, part of that process came about through a process of cruelty. And so let me read what he says on aphorism 46. He says, "The sort of faith demanded and often achieved by early Christianity in the middle of a skeptical, southern, free-spirited world, a world that had century-long struggles between schools of philosophy behind and inside it, not to mention the education and tolerance given by the Imperium Romanum, this faith is not the simple, rude, peon's faith with which a Luther or a Cromwell or some other northern barbarian of the spirit clung to its God and its Christianity. It is much closer to Pascal's faith, which has the gruesome appearance of a protracted suicide of reason, a tough, long-lived, worm-like reason that cannot be killed all at once and with a single stroke. From the beginning, Christian faith has been sacrifice of all freedom, of all pride, of all self-confidence. Of the spirit, it is simultaneously enslavement and self-derision, self-mutilation." So a lot of what he's going to talk about in this section are in what way is it that? And one of the things that he says in the Genealogy of Morals, which is related here because what Nietzsche wrote after writing Beyond Good and Evil is the Genealogy of Morals, and so he kind of had developed some of these thoughts and he kind of honed in a little bit more on some of his ideas. And so if we think about what it means for us to be able to make a promise. And so if we're able to make a promise, then basically what we are able to do is to do something in the future that we are saying we will do now. So that entails a couple things, right? That means we have to have some sense of knowledge or awareness of what is possible for us to do in the future. So we can't promise the impossible. No one would accept such a promise as a promise. So both the person who's promising and the person who's accepting or seeing the promise as a promise has to have a kind of awareness of likelihoods and probabilities that this is likely to happen. The other thing is that the person has to remember the promise, right? So if I promise to do something next week, then I have to remember as next week rolls around that I promised to do such and such a thing. Not everyone has that capability of memory. Some people just sort of in some of his other writings, Nietzsche talks about animals that completely live in the present. They don't have a memory that persists where they can remember something they did last week. They're completely in the moment. We aren't in the moment. We have a kind of historical sense. And so how do we come to remember things? Well, one of the ways we come to remember things is through cruelty, which is kind of a strange thing. But if you think about it, if a child does something wrong when they're young, kind of forms of punishment are a way of getting them to remember not to do that again. You know, I mean, spanking or timeout or various forms of punishment can be that. And in societies, we'll also see a lot of cruelty. And until fairly recently, you would have outside the city gates of London into the 1700s the heads of decapitated people on pikes to let people know that as they enter the city, there's a law in that city, and this is what happens to people who break those laws. So it's on the one hand a kind of message to remember that when you're here to do what is lawful, to do what is legal. And people who are outlaws, they are literally, at least traditionally, outside the law. So they would be no longer protected by the law, which meant that anyone could do anything they wanted to them. They could beat them, kill them, bring them in as if they were an outlaw that had a bounty on their head. They could kill them and bring them in and get a reward. But they were no longer protected by the law. So they would, usually the outlaw would leave the place where they were declared an outlaw and then be tracked down if they were deemed important enough, if the reward were high enough. But again, these are all various forms of punishment, and often they took very cruel forms. And many, you know, the gladiators of Rome, and so we can see all sorts of aspects where cruelty is something that, for Nietzsche, is part of our human nature, that we are not opposed to cruelty by itself. And actually, it can play an important role in causing us to remember things. I think there's a reason why you had public executions and had all those. It kind of drilled into people that don't be bad. These are things that will happen. But what ended up happening, and this is where religion plays an important role for Nietzsche, is that through religious practices, we internalized a lot of the external forms of punishment and cruelty and turned it into kind of an internalized form of punishment and cruelty that comes as the feeling of guilt and bad conscience. Because if we think of what the feeling of guilt and bad conscience is, it's a form of internal suffering caused by oneself. You're causing yourself to suffer and feel bad as a result of even having bad thoughts. So if we think about like the practice of confession in the Catholic Church, at one point, as I understand it, began as a kind of confession before everyone. You kind of said your sins and so on, but it became over time a private confession where you in secret would share your thoughts and actions. And again, the key word here is thoughts and actions. So it's not just what you did, but it is also the things you thought. You coveted something. And in coveting something, you may not have acted upon it, but just the thought itself becomes something that's a sin or something that is bad that you shouldn't have done. And you think and reflect upon your thoughts and actions over the week, and then you go to confess those. And as a result, what ends up happening is this emergence of a kind of conscience, a self-reflective, internal policing or superego, as Freud will develop this notion. And Freud was very influenced by what Nietzsche wrote, and I think in some ways we could see his idea of superego was developing from Freud's idea of, not Freud's, from Nietzsche's ideas here about conscience and guilt and so on. But in many ways, it's a kind of process of punishment that has been internalized. And punishment was often a form of cruelty to get people to remember and to behave, to be good. And so religion has a key role in social cultural history as to how we do things and think about things today. So that was the first one that I want to look at, the first of 6. So the second one I want to look at kind of brings up sort of the contrast that is just water. The contrast that Nietzsche is setting up with Christianity. And this is aphorism number 49, so it's a much shorter aphorism. I could read the whole thing. I read the whole thing, the other one, but some of the ones that I'll read today, I'll only be able to read part of them. But it's okay, you have the whole one. So 49, and I'll just read it and then we'll talk about it. So he says, what is amazing about the religiosity of ancient Greeks is the excessive amount of gratitude that flows out from it. It takes a very noble type of person to face nature and life like this. Later, when the rabble gained prominence in Greece, religion became overgrown with fear as well, and Christianity was on the horizon. So thinking about fear and Greek, so there's an attitude here that of exuberance, excessive amount of gratitude, sort of a joy, and things are flowing from that excess. So if we recall what I mentioned, I think in the previous class or class before, when we talked about reasons to get married or to have kids. And one of the reasons to not have kids, remember, or not get married, is to have them complete you. So where that's coming from a perspective of lack. You're coming from a perspective where you're empty. You need to be completed. You need to be filled up. And when you're in that perspective, then you need someone else to fill you up. But you're also in a state of fear, because if you lose that other person, then you're back to being empty again or half filled. You end up becoming, so there's a kind of fear based there. And also if you're kind of half filled or only partial, you also feel there's a sense of weakness. You're not complete. You're at greater risk. You're at greater threat of things happening. So that also gives rise to fear. So there's this fear right around the corner, and then religion comes along, and this is one of the things that he's going to talk about in later aphorisms. Fear comes along to, religion comes along to help us overcome that fear, to feel good about ourselves as suffering, incomplete, sinning individuals. But that's not the Greek view. The Greek view is we are complete, we're excessive, we are full of life and thankful for this life. And the religiosity that comes from that is a sort of a feast, a celebration of joy and of sharing with others. Now, you do have that in Christian and other religious traditions as well. You have feast days, you have celebrations and gatherings that are shared and so on. So some of that carries over as well. So what he's talking about here for Nietzsche is our tendencies that happen with the religion. So one is this tendency to fear, this tendency to self-denial, to a denial of instinct, a denial of one's natural ways of doing things. And then the other is an embrace and affirmation of that. That's a theme that's kind of gone through a lot of this. So that's, I think, what Nietzsche's kind of contrasting, sort of the religion he sees preceding his day. Because remember, he's living in a secular period, not in a religious period. Remember, he's living in an era where God is dead. We're now more of a secular society. I'll say a bit more about that in a few minutes. All right, this is probably a point where we would have some good discussion. You'd probably all have something to say, and that lead us to talk about various things. But I have posted a place where you can ask questions, and you could go on and talk about things, and I can answer these questions. And on Tuesday the 18th, when I'm back, after the survey that you'll be taking for 15 minutes. We'll continue this sort of discussion and may very well spend Tuesday and Thursday finishing up with Nietzsche. I may toy with the syllabus. We'll see. I'll let you know over the next week what we'll be doing when I'm back. So let me move on now to aphorism number 53. So aphorism 53, he says, so again, to sort of introduce this one, Nietzsche is widely credited with being an atheist. And one thing to think about when we think about what is atheism, so obviously it's contrasted with theism. So theism then is a belief in God. So polytheism would be a belief in many gods. So the ancient Greeks, for instance, had a kind of polytheistic viewpoint, as did the ancient Romans. But then with Christianity, it shifted to a monotheistic religion, so one God. But even in the early church, there was debates about whether Jesus was God in a distinct and separate way from God, or whether there was an evil God in contrast to God, the good God. There were a number of these debates in the early Christian period that kind of dealt with that issue of multiple gods. And you can kind of understand why it would have happened, because Christianity emerged in the context of ancient Roman society, which in turn emerged in the context of ancient Greek society, where they were both polytheistic. So having multiple gods was not a heresy at that point in time. It was fairly normal par for the course. But it does emerge with the Council of Nicaea. It becomes orthodoxy for Christians to believe in one God. So even though there's the Trinity, it's three persons in one God. So atheism then would be a denial of either gods, period, whether multiple gods or one God. So it would say that there is no God. And so with that in mind, let me read what he says on 53, and we can then raise the question, is Nietzsche an atheist? So he says, why atheism today? God the Father has been thoroughly refuted, and so has the judge and the reward giver. The same for God's free will. He doesn't listen. Even if he did, he wouldn't know how to help anyway. The worst part of it is he seems unable to communicate in an intelligible manner. Is he unclear? After hearing, questioning, discussing many things, these are the causes I have found for the decline of European theism. It seems to me that the religious instinct is indeed growing vigorously, but that it rejects any specifically theistic gratification with profound distrust. So he's setting up a contrast here between theism, which is based on the notion that there's this God with these various properties, with the religious instinct. And I think what's important here for Nietzsche is that the religious instinct is satisfying a certain craving for meaning, a craving for mystery, a craving for something that is otherworldly, something that brings us outside the normal, mundane, kind of everyday, common ways of doing things. And in some ways, religions do that. They kind of break up the week. They kind of bring us out of the normal routines and religious experiences, to the extent that those have been important in the history of various religions. Religious experiences will also bring people out of their normal, everyday, common way of doing things, give them a transformative view on life and the world. So all those things are various aspects of a kind of religion as a way of sort of making sense of one's world and one's place in the world, and as a kind of source of values. But that's kind of a religious instinct that would be different from the doctrines that go with a particular church. So the doctrines that go with a church that's theistic, many of those doctrines in the era of modern science have come to be doubted. right? So in the scientific context, God is with a free will. That's being replaced more by a kind of naturalistic scientific view where nature is a deterministic sort of rational clockwork mechanism more than anything else. And there's no free will or even no need for God in the context of thinking about nature and reality that way. So, in that sense, then, um, over the modern periods with the rise of modern science, it's not surprising that society's become more and more secular. More and more people have found reasons to be skeptical of the traditional beliefs that go with a theistic view of religion. But, and this is the way he ends that aphorism, the religious instinct, far from declining, as he puts it, the religious instinct is indeed growing vigorously. So there's still a looking for the type of meaning that and significance that the church gave, but we are now in a society where churches are no longer kind of the meaningful places they used to be for many people, but the religious instinct is looking for other places to land. And that was Nietzsche's concern, as I've said before. He was concerned, well, where might these places be? Like, where might people end up landing when it comes to satisfying their religious instinct? Because as he says in that aphorism, the theistic gratification was no longer satisfying that religious instinct. And so, what is going to satisfy it now? And that's why later on in Beyond Good and Evil, we'll see he predicts a lot of great wars in the 20th century because we will find other places for it to land. And you can kind of guess what he has in mind, even though he didn't live, he died in 1900, he didn't live to see all these things come to pass. He sort of anticipated that they would come to pass. So that leads me to probably the central aphorism of today's lecture, or of this lecture, and that is the number 55. And the reason it's central is that over the years since I've been teaching Nietzsche, and it's been a while, I've been teaching Nietzsche, a number of people will come along and they will know that Nietzsche is often considered to be an nihilist. And so the question then is, well, what does it mean to be a nihilist? And one meaning of nihilist is that you don't believe in anything. And I think for Nietzsche, what nihilism means is that we don't have beliefs in, we no longer will. We no longer have the source of meaning that we used to have. There is no source of meaning anymore that we have. So, and this is aphorism 55. So let me read number 55. So he says, there is a great ladder of religious cruelty, and of its many rungs, 3 are the most important. So again, he's bringing up this theme of cruelty that we've talked about. But now he's going to get specific and kind of list some of the things that he has in mind. So he says, people used to make human sacrifices to their God, perhaps even sacrificing those they loved the best. This sort of phenomena can be found in the sacrifice of the firstborn, a practice shared by all prehistoric religions, as well as in Emperor Tiberius's sacrifice in the Mithras grotto on the Isle of Capri, the most gruesome of all Roman anachronisms. So Tiberius, kind of brought back some of the childhood sacrifices that you have from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians kind of were notorious for doing child sacrifices to the gods in order to win their favor, in order to have victory in battle and things like that. So not only was it not uncommon, it was actually common to have these types of sacrifices. Now, that doesn't mean everyone was sacrificing every kid, but it was something in times of crisis where it was extremely important to do so. The way to get things done or to win the gods' favor was through sacrifice, and human sacrifice was one of the forms of it. So as Nietzsche's saying, that is a cruelty, right? The killing of one's child in order to please or satisfy the gods. Now this will become a sacrifice of a lamb. And in the Bible itself, you have the famous story of Abraham and Isaac, which I talked about with Kierkegaard, right? Where God is telling Isaac to slay and sacrifice his only son. God is telling Abraham to slay and sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And he goes up to the mountain fully committed to doing that. And it's only later on that God then gives you the sheep, says, "Oh, kill the sheep instead." So the traditional forms of sacrifice, but it's still a form of cruelty, in this case to an animal, killing an animal as a form of sacrifice. So that's the first ladder of cruelty. The second, he goes on. Then, during the moral epoch of humanity, people sacrificed the strongest instincts they had, their nature, to their god. The joy of this particular festival shines in the cruel eyes of the ascetic, the enthusiastic peace of anti-nature. Finally, what was left to be sacrificed? So in other words, the second prong of this ladder is one sacrifices one's own nature. So this is going to be where I've said a few times, Nietzsche has kind of a love-hate attitude towards Socrates and Plato. And we've seen some of the reasons for the hate part. And another reason for the hate part is that he sees both Socrates and Plato as kind of a denial of the body, a denial of this life, of the things in this life. So if anything, our body as a finite kind of limited resource in the world is an impediment to really getting at the truth. And it's only the soul, the mind, that can really get at the truth. And the body really kind of gets in the way. And in fact, in the Phaedo, which is the dialogue where Socrates drinks the hemlock and dies, all the guys who are around him are all sad. He says, why should I be sad? My entire life as a philosopher, I have been learning to die, by which he means, and wanting to die, by which he means he has been trying to learn the truth that is eternal, unchanging, and not of this world. The things of this world are true by virtue of this otherworldly reality. And he feels and believes and has faith that when he dies, he will be able and come to know these eternal truths. So why should he be afraid of death when his entire life he's been wanting to have the kind of knowledge that comes with death, that kind of the knowledge of the eternal? So you can kind of see how this kind of Platonic notion, Socratic notion, gets turned into sort of the Christian notion that you will know God and the eternal after you die. So that's, again, one of the reasons why Nietzsche will claim that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. But what also goes in that process, and this is the cruelty part, is that one way of showing one's devotion to the divine, to the otherworldly, is to deny the pleasures, the desires, and the instincts of this body. So the ascetic practices of celibacy, of not talking, or Lenten practices of giving up chocolate or whatever, those kinds of practices. And that you see those in other religions too, in Hinduism, and he'll talk about Hinduism. You'll have these ascetic priests who will go to great lengths to deny themselves food, sleep, keep their arms uplifted for years, things that we just would be completely unnatural for us to do, and it often does damage to the body, but it's a symptom of their commitment to what's not of this life, of this world, of this body. So it's that second ladder where suddenly we're now sacrificing our nature, our instincts. So that's the second rung of the ladder. And now to the third rung of the ladder. Finally, what was left to be sacrificed? In the end, didn't people have to sacrifice all comfort and hope? Everything holy or healing? Any faith in a hidden harmony or a future filled with justice and bliss? Didn't people have to sacrifice God himself and worship rocks, stupidity, gravity, fate, or nothingness out of sheer cruelty to themselves? To sacrifice God for nothingness? That paradoxical mystery of the final cruelty has been reserved for the race that is now approaching. By now, we all know something about this. So again, we now, with the turn to science, we no longer have a sense of meaning from God as giving us a purpose and a destination goal. We've given that up. We've now turned to gravity, right? The law of gravity. Rocks, right? We're all basically, I don't know, on a par with rocks, all made of chemical compositions and bonding of atoms, and we're all basically the same in that regard. So there's an equality here, but it's an equality of biochemical stuff and nothing ultimately meaningful. And that's the sense in which we have come to the point where nothingness becomes what we are left with after we have sacrificed everything else. And so the question then is, where does this leave us? And I think that is one of the things that is going to be interesting for Nietzsche. And I think that's, again, where the religious instinct comes in that I was talking about with the previous aphorism. Which one was that? That was number 53, as we were talking about that. So I think that's where that question will come back in as we go in not only to the later aphorisms in the reading for today, but also the latter pages of Beyond Good and Evil. We'll take all that up as well. Okay. Again, I think there would probably be lots of discussion at this point. Class would probably be over. I think we'd probably have run out of time at this point. But as I said, we will talk about some of these points come the 18th. Okay, so I'm now on to the next to last aphorism, which taps into, again, this notion of meaning, religion and meaning. This is number 61. So I'm going to read the first line, and then I'm going to jump ahead where he starts talking about the common people. So this will bring up some of the themes that we've talked about today in class. This is Thursday, the 6th that I'm recording this. So I don't know when you'll be watching it, but on this class we talked about the common, and we've seen that already. I started today with the truth and common as one final theme from the reading for Thursday that I wanted to cover, but we didn't have time. Now it kind of gets brought back up again with respect to religion. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about suffering and the role of religion in suffering, and that will bring me up to the final aphorism. Okay, so start off number 61. He says, "The philosopher, as we understand him, we free spirits, as the man with the most comprehensive responsibility, whose conscience bears the weight of the overall development of humanity, this philosopher will make use of religion for his breeding and education work, just as he will make use of the prevailing political and economic situation." So again, back to the free spirits from the section before, and then the philosophers of the future. And what does he say? This philosopher will make use of religion. So religion is not something to be done away with. Religion is going to have a use. And what's it a use for? It will be for the overall development of humanity. So remember, one of the things that we've talked about, that plowshare of evil metaphor that I've talked about a few times. And the point about the plowshare of evil is that the new will always come across and appear as evil, as something unknown, unfamiliar, and threatening. And so if we think about what is going to be threatening, very often something that is threatening is something that is unknown, something that is potentially harmful to us. And what is going to be harmful to us? Well, something that's unknown, maybe, right? That's part of the reason that we would be worried about it, because if we knew it and we knew it wasn't harmful, we wouldn't be worried about it. So the new is often taken on as something fearful and threatening. And so this philosopher of the future, who's kind of bringing out the new, will be doing so with the help of religion. Religion will play a role in this sort of creative process, the process of embracing mystery, the unknown, because as one is creating and bringing out the new, you don't know where it's going to go. And we can say, for instance, that we always live in times where we don't know where things are going to go. But right now, politically and social culturally, I think we're probably living through a time where it's very unknown where things are going to go. What will the consequences be? Uh, for many years, it seemed like lots of things followed a kind of predictable path and wasn't big differences between one elected person and another, or lots of things. So you get into social cultural habits, and then you have these transformative moments and things change. Does it change for the better or the worse? Again, for Nietzsche, there is no goal in history that is all for the better. Things could change for the worse, or it could change for the better. Who knows? But during times of change, the natural reaction is one of uncertainty because one doesn't know where one is going. And so religion plays a role in here because it helps us to embrace the mystery, helps us to accept the mystery and the unknown of this process. So philosophers will put that to work, the philosophers of the future. Now, how does this all relate to the common people? Now I come to the end part of this aphorism. And it's a long aphorism, and he talks a little bit about Brahmins and Hindus in here. That's why I'm going to talk a little bit about Buddhism in a second. So he says, finally, as for the common people, the great majority who exist and are only allowed to exist to serve and to be of general utility, religion gives them an invaluable sense of contentment with their situation and type. It puts their hearts greatly at ease. It glorifies their obedience. It gives them and those like them one more happiness and one more sorrow. It transfigures and improves them. It provides something of a justification for everything commonplace, for all the lowliness, for the whole half-bestial poverty of their souls. Religion and the meaning religion gives to life spreads sunshine over such eternally tormented people and makes them bearable even to themselves. It has the same effect that an Epicurean philosophy usually has on the suffering of higher ranks. It refreshes, refines, and makes the most of suffering, as it were. In the end, it even sanctifies and justifies. Perhaps there's nothing more venerable about Christianity and Buddhism than their art of teaching even the lowliest to use piety in order to situate themselves in an illusory or higher order of things, and in so doing, stay satisfied with the actual order in which their lives are hard enough. So we have a number of things in here that kind of bring in issues from Dostoevsky. Remember the Grand Inquisitor passage where the Jesus character is talking with the Inquisitor, and the Inquisitor says, these people don't want the freedom that you're giving them. They want the obedience because we give them bread, right? We give them the stuff that they need. We give them the stuff that makes their lives content and comfortable. They don't want to be thrown onto freedom where life might become hard and unpredictable and unknown. And you saw how that played itself out in Underground Man, where the Underground Man, everyone's following things by the book, but if you really try to be different and break from the book, you either become an outcast or you end up not having a reason for it, because everyone has a reason, has to have some sort of kind of knowledge and certainty. And so we have all those issues that came up with Dostoevsky. And so here for Nietzsche, what religion does is it provides contentment and justification for people's everyday lives that might have suffering in it. And I think this is, for Nietzsche, one of the themes that is important both in Buddhism and Christianity. Nietzsche had a good friend who was a Buddhist scholar, which in the late 1800s was a somewhat unusual thing, right? Most people in the late 1800s knew very little about Buddhism because there wasn't a lot of research material or documents or texts to read to learn about Buddhism. Obviously, that's changed. There's a ton out there now. But you had to be able to go read the Pali texts and all the various other texts out there to understand Buddhism. And this friend of his knew it fairly well. He was probably the leading scholar at the time. And so Nietzsche knew a fair bit about Buddhism, such as there was available to be known. And he did know, which is true, that in Buddhism there are four noble truths. And the first of those noble truths is that life is suffering. And that one of the other noble truths of the four is that one can overcome suffering by overcoming attachment. So if we think, for instance, that you are attached to yourself, your ego, and part of your fear is that when you die, your ego will be gone. You will no longer have the self that you are. And so that fear of the loss of self is something that it only happens because you're attached to it. If you're no longer attached to that ego, if it passes, it's no big deal, and you won't be fearful of it, and that fear won't cause the suffering. Maybe think about your pets. You have pets, and you're attached to them. You love your pets, and then when they die, there's some suffering and sadness because you were attached to them. You liked them. So it's not to say that one shouldn't get pets because they might die and you don't want to have any suffering. But the idea for the Buddhists is that the more we accept that all things pass, and the more lightly we touch things, the more we see things from that perspective, the less attached we get to them, and therefore we overcome suffering. So one of the goals then for Buddhism is to kind of, through meditative practice and other practices, which is one of the Eightfold Path is the other Buddhist idea, that these are the steps you take to kind of overcome attachment and hence overcome suffering. The goal is, again, to overcome suffering in this life. Christianity also kind of takes this attitude that life is suffering, and one of the things about suffering is that it will end. We will, when this life ends, we will have a life of salvation and grandeur and glory, and it won't be a life of suffering. And so in both cases, in Christianity and Buddhism, there's a kind of key moment where part of the goal of those religions are to give one the sense that this life is okay because suffering will be ended in the end. And Nietzsche's point is that suffering can actually be helpful, right? Suffering is not necessarily a bad thing. Suffering can be a source of creativity, a source of kind of, drive and attention and attentiveness to what one is doing, to getting things done in the way that will help humanity overall. So again, he will talk about it as great suffering in one of his writings. So great suffering is a suffering that is great precisely because it becomes inseparable from the creative process that advances society and culture. And so that could be part of a kind of a rethought religious practice or belief in the sort of philosophers of the future, the free spirits of the future. So now come to the final passage, and these are the final words of the religious character chapter. So it is very end of aphorism number 62. Let's see here. So when he talks about, but if somebody with opposite needs were to approach the almost willful degeneration and atrophy of humanity that the Christian European, Pascal for instance, has become, somebody whose manner is no longer Epicurean, but has instead some divine hammer in hand, wouldn't he have to yell out in rage, in pity, in horror? Oh, you fools, you presumptuous, pitying fools, what have you done here? Was that work meant for your hands? Look how you've wrecked and ruined my most beautiful stone. Who gave you the right to do such a thing? What I mean is this, just kind of that was all sort of set up, and so this is the key passage I wanted to stress. Christianity has been the most disastrous form of arrogance so far. People who were not high and hard enough to give human beings artistic form, people who were not strong or far-sighted enough, who lacked the sublime self-discipline to give free rein to the foreground law of ruin and failure by the thousands, people who were not noble enough to see the abysmally different orders of rank and chasms in rank between different people. People like this, with their equality before God, have prevailed over the fate of Europe so far, until a stunted, almost ridiculous type, a herd animal, something well-meaning, sickly, and mediocre, has finally been bred, the European of today. So one of the things that's key in that passage, and it kind of sets things up for where we're going to be going in the rest of Beyond Good and Evil, is the sort of cultural critique of contemporary society that Nietzsche was living in. And remember, I've talked about it a few times already. So he sees contemporary society as very, as did Dostoevsky, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and even Kierkegaard to some extent, which is some of the reasons why Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard are kind of put into the same sort of philosophical school, existentialism. Kind of not completely fair or accurate to do that, but you can kind of see why, because they have a similar critique of the society or culture that they lived in. And what we've seen in this religious character chapter is that religion had a role to play in getting us to this point. Okay, but we are no longer in a society where religion is the main influence in people's lives, right? We're in a secular society. And we're now in a society where we have this sort of herd instinct, this herd morality, this sort of pressures to conformity, and a kind of nihilism where people just don't really have any moral compass or any moral foundations anymore. And none of the sort of soil that would encourage and foster the kind of creative individuals. So it seems to be a very troubled and problematic situation that society and culture is in. And so what Nietzsche proposes is, well, it's not that what he proposes, but what Nietzsche sets out to do is to critique this culture. And we've already seen him do some of that, but what he's going to do and much of the rest of Beyond Good and Evil is to critique the sort of the European of today as he ends it. And so what we'll do next class is we'll go over the epigrams and interludes. So I talked about that at the end of class today. So there are many of them. So there's like 120 or something like that. So I'd pick a few in case the one that you pick is done first. So we will not do duplicates. So someone might do one, oh yeah, I really like that one too. And that'll be good. We can talk about it. We'll talk about each of them, but we'll probably spend much of the class just going through that. And we'll probably end up spending Thursday finishing off the Nietzsche. So what I will do tomorrow, I will give a lecture on the natural history of morals. I'll post that as well. So this will be actually on a module. It'll be posted there. And the other thing I will be posting later this evening, this is Thursday, February 6th, they'll be posting the paper topics for the 1,000-word essays. But I think that's it for today. I hope you all have a good rest of the day or evening, depending on what time you happen to be watching this. Take care.